Uh, Thanks, Josh, for having me back again. And thanks for everybody for joining us today. It's great. I mean, it'll be great to be able to record this, but this is also a topic I love talking about. So having a chance to do it again, why the heck not? My original title slide had my title, which was at the time Project Director of Digital Experiences at the Exploratorium. I have since come back to New York, and I am back on the market doing consulting and working with people individually as organizations. So that is one change from the last time we presented. So I'm going to dive into it. And I figured kind of like a standard format. I'll tell you a little bit about myself, why this topic matters to me. I'll show you some stuff that I've done, and then we'll talk a little bit about some of the things that how I apply some of these ideas about designing for feelings and emotions. Full disclosure, I'm a total optimist. I'm a big yes-ander. I love this idea of saying yes and to big, crazy ideas and then dialing them back to the more pragmatic approach. But I like to go big and dial it back from there. I figure the way I tell my students when I teach this stuff is if you take big steps, you're more likely to get to your destination faster and even course correct faster. But if you're always conservative and taking tiny steps, it'll take you forever to get anywhere. And it's less likely you're going to learn along the way. I also want to shout out my wife went and got me a new webcam today because she said the last one I had made me look like I was talking on the surface of Mars. So thank you to Keishi. If I look any better today, it's her. It's because of her. So my career, I started as a political cartoonist. Way back when, I was a political cartoonist during the Clinton era and the original George Bush Sr. eras. I think this is foundational to sort of my identity as an artist, this idea of working fast, living with your decisions. And I was surprised how often people would challenge me walking around town. They'd be like, oh, I read your comic and I totally disagree with you. And early on, it really kind of bummed me out. It would upset me. I was like, oh, I upset somebody. I did the wrong thing. But then I realized, with the guidance of a really helpful editor, that this was an invitation to have a provocative, interesting, divergent conversation with people. And I really embraced that idea. This idea of if you can prompt somebody to have an emotional reaction in which they want to defend maybe an alternate perspective, that's great. So as a political cartoonist, this is what I originally wanted. You know, I wanted kind of adulation. I wanted people to be like, ooh, aren't you smart? Aren't you wise? Aren't you funny? And I wanted validation, right? But then what I started getting from my audience is I would get a little bit of like, hey, that was a great comic today. And I would also get a lot of people who were upset with me. And I found it like humans I kind of glommed it into this pretty reductive sort of spectrum of human emotion, all the way from like grouchy to just flat out stunned. And I started becoming aware of sort of like the spectrum through which people would experience things. And I came up with this general idea that the idea isn't to be polarizing, but to create a space, a volume in which people can express and feel like a range of emotions, where maybe sadness or upsetness or joy could kind of like co-occupy the same space. This I know comes with sort of like all kinds of ideas of how do you create the space, how do you support people within that space. The other thing that it does, it means being prepared as a creator to accept beliefs and values other than your own. I included that as a parenthetical, but it's actually maybe the core idea here, is being inclusive of ideas that are not your own. And how do you create those spaces? Also this idea that if you create something that somebody loves, you probably create something someone hates. You know, it's Marvel versus the DCEU, it's Apple versus Google. It's these debates people get passionate about, brand loyalties and things like that. And I think that's okay. I kind of find as a designer, if I try to please everybody equally, I'm not creating a space for anybody to love anything or hate anything. And sometimes I don't mind if somebody is motivated, again, to argue or express a different opinion. I put this in here because I love this as an optical illusion. Super simple, but if you just Gently soften the focus of your eyes. You'll notice that these white dots at the intersections of the gray lines kind of shift color, grayscale values. And I love this idea because it's static, it's not animated. It's just a JPEG, but we all experience it differently because of the lighting of our space, because of maybe sort of like the physiology of our eyes, whatever. We're all looking at the same thing and experiencing it differently. And I think that in experience design is a thing to be celebrated. You can't force anyone to see or believe or experience anything in a singular way. So, a couple things worked on. I saw Ashley was in the group. Thank you for joining, Ashley. We had a great conversation last week. Ashley and I know each other because we worked on the Futures exhibition down at the Arts and Industries building, the Smithsonian in DC. Great experience. One of the projects that I kind of oversaw was the development of this sort of multimodal sort of survey in which we were taking responses from people about their visions of the future, what their values really of the future. It was basically a jumped up survey that used haptic controllers and holograms and all this kind of stuff to feel like it was of the future. 60% of the nation. Ooh, hey Scott.
So
I think your mic is live, Scott.
sorry.
No worries. And it was kind of cool because it was designed as a survey. We ended up being able to learn quite a bit about our users over the time, the 6-7 months that this exhibition was live. On the left are some sample questions. A lot of them were kind of like timeline questions or Likert scale questions. And just a couple highlights from what we learned is of the 650,000 people who responded, 97% reported a shift after visiting the exhibition and their mindset or emotions around the future. But you can read these on your own. But we actually ended up learning a lot. And one of the things that I learned is when we set up the framing for this, we didn't know whether people were going to have an optimistic or pessimistic view of the future. We assumed, because this was like prep work was all during the pandemic, that people were going to like overwhelmingly express pessimism, sort of like dystopic views of the future. But what we really found, and I can't remember if I have the slide here or not, is it here? Yeah. Is that visitors felt hopeful. They expressed hope for the future and an equal lack of empowerment or agency to create that future, which I thought was fascinating. That we got these polar opposites on sort of like a Foursquare style question, which creates, I think, kind of this pocket where you can actually really focus on agency and affordance and how do you give people the tools to solve problems for themselves and create futures for themselves. I don't think we really, at least the work that I was doing in that exhibition, we didn't really follow through on the agency aspect. I think we're in the learning mode, but that's something I took away from this project, is how to support people taking action in the real world. I do a lot of improv stuff. This is a performance that I co-directed in which dancers and musicians were improvising a performance progression from the base chakra to the crown chakra based on a Japanese sound healing methodology called Tamado. And I was basically the conductor, and that spreadsheet screenshot is literally how I was directing the show. I had, I think, an iPad. You can see I'm there playing drums in the background in that top left shot. And I was directing the show and sort of coordinating all the kind of giving people cues on dynamics and key changes just from a spreadsheet. And it was amazing. It ended up being this kind of spreadsheet driven and deeply emotional experience. The shirtless guy right there was one of the audience's favorite performers because, well, look at the guy. Recently, this is exciting. Project I worked on at the Smithsonian was given an Excellence in Exhibitions Award. The Cell Phone Unseen Connections exhibition. Thank you, Erica. I just saw you clapping. I did a lot of the early stage media concepts development for this. You know, the slide here is just showing this giant cell phone that as soon as you walk up to it, it just simply maps an emoji to your face. Kind of dead simple in terms of its interaction, but like gleeful. People have a blast with this. You're not learning much, but you're kind of priming people to this idea of, ooh, I'm gonna have fun in this space. And that was the idea there. Here are a couple other sort of experiences on the slide or the screenshot on the left. Again, kind of a survey that was baked into the experience itself, in which you're having a chat through your personal mobile device with these characters. You're part of a group chat and they're asking you questions throughout, kind of like a WhatsApp group. And so again, I love this idea of experiences that operate as mirrors. They kind of share back who we are, what we value, and how those compare to what other people value in the world. I think that's evolving as an operating principle for me. And then the woman on the right, that's my wife who got me the good webcam. So thank you, Keishi. Here's a project I'm doing right now. It's in its second evolution, Deep Frank. It's a Frank Oppenheimer from the Exploratorium. The first version, I just made a deep fake of Frank using a whole sort of pipeline of AI tools in which he gives a speculative speech about the importance of art and science today. The second version of that is an actual GPT that responds to you in the voice of Frank, chatting, type text. But I've primed it, I've given it a bunch of rule sets in which it sort of like reflects back at you, sort of like Frank's values and the values of the Exploratorium as they've evolved over the decades. The next step is to create a speaking visual avatar of Frank who responds in the spoken language in the voice of Frank Oppenheimer. Josh and I have talked about maybe doing a workshop on sort of the development of these. So if anybody is interested in taking a workshop about the creation of a GPT in the voice of somebody else, let Josh know and we can make that happen. A couple other things really quickly. I'll fly through these. This is a piece that I did, a Unity-based game engine in which you can walk through works of art from the Metropolitan Museum of Art's collection. So I was extrapolating height maps from 2D paintings, rendering those height maps as landscapes, and embedding within those landscapes quotes and tidbits and knowledge about the process of these different artists. I'm just always looking, this is one of my pandemic prototypes, just looking for new ways to interact with things that we kind of take for granted. Another improv project in which a bunch of musicians and a bunch of dancers who have never performed together would host a 3-hour show. It was a 3-act structure. The first act, orient people to the rules, set the tone, get people comfortable. Second act, the dancers and the musicians would sort of model yes and behavior and sort of the latitude in interpreting prompts. And then the third act would kind of invert and the audience would become the performers. Used to host this regularly in New York City, underground below a sushi restaurant called Jaban, which feels like a very New York thing. But the entire thing is based on trust and authenticity. And we'll talk a little bit about onboarding or orientation, but the first year of running this is where I figured out how to onboard people to the experience. And I realized, it took me a year to realize that that first hour of a 3-hour experience was what it took to prime people to be in the emotional state of mind to just say yes to whatever came their way. Let's see. So, in general, I want people to feel welcome, powerful, and surprised. I really like my three kind of, I kind of vacillate between social, educational, and entertaining, and with experience at the center, or this new model I'm working out, which is the voice, the heart, and the mind. So the voice is social, the heart is cognitive, or the mind is cognitive, and the heart is emotional. And those are the 3 layers of interaction that I really want to kind of weave and kind of like have people flex in and out of. And I love this idea that stories are everywhere. They're embedded in everything that we do. And everybody is a storyteller in some way, particularly with social media. Like, storytelling has become like the boom. And fundamentally, they're about relationships. They're about connections or broken connections with people. And this idea of being able to explore them. For 15 years, I was an art director in the video game industry. And this idea of relationships, I think, was really, really powerful to me. Sort of like relationships between players, relationships between developers and their audience. And I really, really love this idea of just sort of focusing on the relationship. Now getting into what we're talking about, feelings. This is a slide I usually show my students, which is like which couch has more of a story? And you could throw it in the chat. What do you think, A or B? Curious to see. I'll open the chat. Yeah, cool. Yeah, most people will say B. Now and then I'll get a provocative student that's like, A, because isn't the story of the engineer and the production and all this of the brand new couch a valid story? And of course it is. But on an emotional level, most people drive straight to B. There's people in the image, it values the human. It's a well-worn couch. You can see the story of like the carpet, the couch, the couple, the background, like a lot of storytelling. Oh, I see Anna asking. I think A looks sad just because it's on a white background, gray couch, like probably stripped directly from like the IKEA website. No stains, no stories yet. But yeah, so the second couch, sort of like any storytelling, is like all about like that full sensory sort of experience. And it starts, slide B or picture B starts to get that. And absolutely putting people in the mix creates bias. You're right, Chris. Which is why I love the social aspect of interactive design and experiential design. It's not didactic. It's not the developer saying, here's what I'm going to teach you now. And it's also not like, here's the place where you give a voice. Like you actually really center the person in the experience in a way that has meaning. So I know there's a lot of people who are starting to challenge the hero's journey narrative, but for sake of familiarity, you've got this idea of general storytelling orientation. You introduce crisis, you escalate that. Your characters have experienced discovery, and then they're fundamentally changed, for better or for worse. George R.R. Martin really introduced us to the for worse version of that when Ned Stark died. Like he was like, other people have done that for probably millennia, but he sort of normalized that in the mainstream. Product development journey, discovery, action, inspiration, follow-up. It follows a similar arc. Discovery is like orientation. These things kind of map to one another. And user experience, when you're doing like customer journeys, you kind of see something similar. Yeah, Rachel, George R.R. Martin might have said that the couch has a better story, maybe because it's a sadder story. But yeah, so a customer journey kind of follows, again, that similar arc. And in experiential design, and these aren't absolutes, these are just kind of models and sort of things to reflect upon. In experience design, orientation, you get somebody to feel something, you engage with those feelings, you allow somebody to express something, and then you support them in that expression. That last one is just sort of me playing with this idea of how do you translate sort of storytelling journeys across different modes. So another pop quiz for those who are active in the chat. What are you more likely to remember? What you learned or what you felt? All right. Yeah, again, a lot of people will gravitate towards B, which when you think about it, what a powerful thing to embrace in design. Like not every experience needs to be just about feeling stuff, but if you can use emotions as kind of a gateway to prime people for learning, like what does that look like? And that's what fascinates me. Cool, I like that Gigi is already coming up with C in there, in the chat. And it also is kind of one of these things that you see like watching debates or politics. People are always like reciting statistics and like, oh, but like the job rate has been influenced this way and blah, 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 blah. And people don't necessarily respond favorably or emotionally to statistics, even though those statistics might have really compelling stories. So how do you tell those stories of they're sort of numeric in a way in which people actually feel it? Because people will vote and people will resonate with things that they feel more than necessarily like pure cognition. The flip side is this can totally backfire. Is if you really, really play the emotional appeal and somebody gets really angry, behaviorally, we kind of shut down in times of stress and anxiety. What we're sort of like neurologically, what we start to do is we start to winnow down our options, and we are less resilient, less adaptive when we're in a really anxious state. So if you get somebody worked up enough that they're angry, they're not going to be a partner in this exploration anymore. Similarly, if somebody's just so outrageously like, yeah, freaking out, having a great time, they're also not probably listening and engaging. So what I try and do is I try and find this sort of sweet spot. Not always an easy balance, but I try and find myself somewhere designing experiences that are between sort of critical and feeling something. Like, and I know the image second from the right is this woman. She's like feeling like joyous, but there's a lot of emotion between those 2 points. And when somebody is so very angry, you don't want them to disengage. And again, if somebody's so distracted by what they felt, they might also be equally disengaged. So I deploy a lot of user testing to try and find sort of like, what is the right emotional lever? What is the motivating emotion within something? Social cognitive, psychophysiological, Christopher Stapleton in the chat. Yes, absolutely. And I think this is, for me anyway, this is core to the experience. The idea that the experience feels genuine. It represents an actual feeling. It's not manipulating somebody. It's not a dark design pattern. It's not trying to get you to click something that you didn't want to click, so now you're on a mailing list forever. It actually feels like a representation of somebody's actual beliefs. I had a really, really amazing experience years ago. 2016, I was working in Indianapolis, Mike Penstown. I was on site as a contractor, and every night I would go out for drinks. And because I was working for my hotel. And one night I was sitting at a bar having a drink and dinner, and there was a couple next to me, and I just turned to the guy next to me. I was like, hey, I have a question. I was like, I'm from New York City. Full disclosure, I'm probably going to vote for Hillary Clinton. But I am curious who you're going to vote for. And the guy he was like, Trump. And I was like, great, no judgments. What I really want to know from you, though, is why. I was like, I'm not here to argue. I'm not here to fight. I'm not here to change your mind. I genuinely want you to share with me why. And the guy was like, the couple looked at each other and they were just like, okay. And they tentatively engaged in the conversation. And when they saw that I wasn't going to judge them and I wasn't there to fight them, I had a phenomenal conversation. I think we learned more about each other on opposite ends of the political spectrum than any conversation I had in my life. And it really struck me. I was like, okay, I was approaching with authenticity, creating a safe space, onboarding him to this sort of experience where he could express who he was. And I was curious. Yes, Ed, you just dropped that in the chat. 100% curiosity. I love this idea in the museum space of sort of like curatorially almost divesting ourselves from the owners of the story. But as curators, how can we be curious? How can we draw people into this, like communities, into the storytelling itself, such that we're not the lords of the truth, but the truth can come from multiple streams and multiple sources. So a couple sort of guideposts that I use. These are not rules. They're not hard and fast. They're not absolute. But generally speaking, I think of framing or onboarding to an experience in terms of 30%. I will allocate at the beginning of production 30% of my calendar time to figuring out how to get somebody to engage in the experience to have a positive experience. And roughly speaking, 30% of that session, I expect will be onboarding them to the experience as well. So yeah, this is I know it's a little mathy. It might seem arbitrary. Not every project requires 30%, depending on its scope and its scale. But that's my starting point when I begin negotiating for myself. How much time do I need to onboard somebody to an experience? Feedback. This is from my days in game design. I love providing feedback to people that is key to meaningful interactions. I wrote proportional and non-proportional feedback because sometimes you want absolute clarity. Like you click a button, you get a sound, plus it's redundant. You see the button change color, you get sound, and maybe it's got some haptics if you've got control of the controllers. But sometimes I would create moments in game design that were like providing like really resonant feedback loaded with mystery, in which people didn't know why that feedback happened, but it was so dramatic they wanted to know why, and they would ask like, what just happened and how can I recreate that moment? And then that would invite them to start re-exploring the experience with this new goal in mind, which is like, what did I do that was kind of hidden that made this massive thing happen, and how do I solve that mystery? And so I kind of like use this sort of, I call it non-proportional feedback because I don't have a great term for it. If anybody has an idea in the chat, let me know. But it's kind of like keying feedback, meaningful feedback to something that is maybe a little unclear or opaque. It's an invitation to explore. Rituals, I think, are hugely powerful. You might just call them design patterns in user experience design or interface design. You're sort of establishing routines and patterns for people, but how do you do that within an experience? How do you do that within a space? I learned from my father this idea. He's a sociologist. He would talk a lot of behavioral scripts, and he would like 90% of all human interaction is already pre-planned. You say good morning to somebody, and without even thinking about it, like good morning, they know. They're primed, they're cued, they have history. That ritual is firmly established. And that's also like a lot of like small talk. And sometimes you have to get past the ritual of conversation to get deep. But how do we leverage ritual and even like create counter rituals, like break a ritual such that it sort of snaps somebody out of it? Like you say good morning, and they're like loaf of bread. That's an interesting moment, like providing the counter to a ritual such that it kind of snaps them into this sort of like this awareness. We're like, oh, that was not what I expected. I should pay attention. So again, not a hard and fast rule, but I love this idea of give people 80% of what they expect and plan for 20% surprise, and create a ritual of surprise, this sort of practice within the experience where they know to expect something is coming. We went and saw the Harry Potter show on Broadway recently, and the Dementors come out and they swoop around the audience, and they do it like 3 times. The first time it's just awesome. You're like, oh my God, you're trying to figure like, what? How is this happening? It's so much like the movie. The second time they come out, you're like, okay, I can see the wires. Okay, now I get it. The third time they come out, you're like, yeah. But then they swoop down on a character on stage, they cover them, and they rush up to the ceiling and the person is gone. Like they established a ritual, they established a pattern, and then they broke it. Just at the point where you thought, I get it, and I'm bored of it. I love that kind of design. So another way to think about the sort of reverse funnel or the spotlight, is you welcome somebody to the experience, you encourage them to feel something, you engage them in that feeling, and then you allow somebody some space to express themselves. When I was at the Exploratorium, I did a lot of drafting of sort of like values and this kind of stuff that are important to me within an experience. This is like kind of dense, it's weirdly formatted and all this stuff, but just going through this exercise of sort of drafting and redrafting what I thought was important to an experience really helped me kind of start to define these principles and know what they are. Because when I know what they are, I can start to deploy them. And then within an experience, I love to connect people, engage them in sort of actions that have meaning. They're embedded in a phenomena, they're embedded in a story, they have space to explore themselves, express. and even magnify things. This is that counter sort of feedback thing. Somebody does some small action and boom, everything changes. And that's actually kind of a tactic, I would say. So yeah, I prompted this last time I gave this talk. This is my final slide, and we'll just chat. It's this project I'm working on right now called Do a Deca Tick Tick Tick. It's a 12-piece vignette. 12 pop-up immersive hybrids in New York City over the course of 12 months. I've got a roadmap for it. I'm developing like in my tech kit. I've got all these principles that I've kind of like just shared with you that I'm using to sort of describe kind of one night only immersive experiences that will happen across sort of the face of New York City. And it's me prototyping a lot of this stuff, because I also think, coming from the museum world, there's a lot of resistance to this kind of like immersive design. It's too expensive, it takes too much time, it's all these reasons why it can't work. And so part of me just loves to be the agent of change and a provocateur. So what I want to do is I've challenged myself to create 12 pop-up immersive experiences in 12 months, not a big budget, reusing similar tech to create fundamentally different experiences. So
Let's talk.
That's my sprint through this stuff.
All right, Brad, love it. All right, anybody have any questions? We can throw it in the chat. I mean, I always have so many questions. I have so many things we can talk about. So, all right, I'll jump in a little bit.
Cool.
So, one of the things I kind of wonder is, so you've been you've jumped through a lot of different mediums, and one of them is sort of like designing museum experiences. Like when you're designing museum experiences, what's different about that medium from other mediums, and like what's similar, what are the lessons that like are worth pulling over from other places, and like what are the lessons that and what should you not?
Wow, you're just like starting off with like the bomb. That's a big one.
Right, let's get right into the thick of it.
So I'll do like my gut level kind of reaction to it. Is this summer I was at Excite, which is this science museum and cultural institution organization, European organizations primarily. It's science-based. It's all museums. All these people show up, and it's hard science focus. And what I've been noticing over the past several years is a move towards telling more emotional stories, more cultural stories, more personal human stories about how people engage with science. Then I went to the WXO event that was hosted at the House of Yes in Brooklyn, here in New York City. And it's all these wild divergent thinkers, experiential designers and theater people, and all doing all this cool stuff, who are really about telling human stories. And they are all now challenging themselves to figure out how do they engage with kind of scientific stories.
Yeah.
And so I'm starting to see sort of like this intersection of what were used to be fairly siloed communities and fairly siloed industries. They're all kind of working towards a center, a common core. And I think that's also represents in a lot of the stuff, like whatever, there's debate in museums, like is the ice cream museum a museum or is it entertainment? And then there are people who are like, does it even matter? If people are walking away and they're having this engaged conversation, they're walking away talking about something differently than they might have previously. I think this entertainment versus, call it education, is a really interesting conversation that's happening right now.
Yeah.
I don't know. I'm curious, like you, Josh, or the people in the room, like, does it matter? Like, do these silos really serve us, or should we try and break them?
Well, it's funny because like I actually had someone from the Museum of Ice Cream on one of these feature spaces.
Yeah.
And I was like, I mean, and I know Manish Four is one of the founders, and like those people are smart, they're savvy, they're not dummies, and there's like a lot there that they understand. But like I was like a super hater for a while, and I had to like kind of like let it go a little bit and like be like, okay, well, like they're like, you don't learn anything about ice cream, they don't have any curators on staff, and like there's no registrars. But like I was like okay, but I'm gonna like let go of some of the judgments and see if there's a there. And like what his talk was about designing for feelings, and they actually have a methodology for mapping emotional journeys over physical space where I was like, this is gold. Like,
Yeah.
and, museums should be paying attention to this because like it's a great, you know, I feel like it's like sort of like being like dismissive of Taylor Swift. I'm like, whatever you like, man. Like she figured a few things out. So like let's show some respect, you know?
I'm with you. There was one of the things from the Ice Cream Museum that I took away is this idea that you come up with your own ice cream name.
Oh yeah.
And a bunch of us at the WXO did it, where it was just like, you come up with your ice cream name. And I was like, what's my ice cream name? And I was like, rum raisin.
Yeah.
And I don't even like rum raisin as a flavor. So then I had to dig in and be like, the person next to me was like, why rum raisin if you don't like it? And I was like,
Because I
oh
feel
yeah,
like an
what
old
does it mean to me?
alcoholic.
I was like, oh, rum, piracy, raisins, pruny, and wizened. And I realized there was a story in this gut reaction decision that I'd made that I actually walked away from that silly prompt with a little bit extra wisdom about myself. Like, oh, this is
Yeah.
what worked to me.
Cool. All right. Oh, let's ask. So people have questions.
Awesome.
Mitchell, do you want to ask your question?
Yeah, sure. I was just curious where I liked how you used the word kind of provocateur, provocation. I always I think it's important to either play that role sometimes myself and to always ensure that I'm inviting that into my own life and the life of my team, and the place I work, to keep pushing forward. And so I'm curious, what do you do to invite in inspiration and provocation to yourself? So if you're doing these, for example, like I'm fascinated by your project 12 pop-ups. Where are you finding ideas for 12 pop-ups, or what are you exposing yourself to, or where are you placing yourself or immersing yourself that those ideas are catalyzed and popping in your brain and that you can
Yeah.
start to play with to begin with?
Thanks for the question, Mitchell. It's a mix, honestly. Like, I kind of believe that ideas are cheap, but execution of ideas is where it really gets tricky. And so what I do is I just generate a volume of ideas. I have probably, call it 3 to 4 dozen ideas that are just starters. And then I went through the list and I just kind of checked in with my gut and did started to star the ones that either like, I was like, ooh, this sparks something in me. Part of it was like, ooh, I want to learn a skill that I will need to do that. One of them, a couple of them were like, ooh, this idea terrifies me. A couple were like, oh, I kind of want to like explore this idea. And it's a kind of a hybrid of different values. Some were phenomenological. Like I was like, ooh, I want to do something with cymatics. I was like, ooh, I want to do something about light. And so there's probably a split between things that scare me, things that I want to learn and teach, and things that I think I want to learn. Yeah. I don't know if that's helpful.
No, it was. I appreciate that. Thanks.
Yeah.
Cool.
And then Brett, I would imagine, you're not doing these by yourself though. Are you bringing a team together? Are you gonna have collaborators?
I'm gonna have collaborators on a sort of per experience. Like I'm gonna have performers
Yeah.
and everything. Right now, I'm just gonna fund it myself.
Okay. Cool.
I'm gonna fund it myself, and just to see what it kind of keep it light and cheap, and see like, how I can do the most with the least.
You will have a lot of freedom in that
Yeah.
and helpful constraints.
Yeah.
Christopher, you had a question. You want to ask it?
Yeah. There's a couple of things. I wrote it in as I went around there. I would have to find my question, but do you see there's a distinction between story play and game, especially as it relates to both entertainment and education, or are they more the same than they are different? And we just haven't really looked at them together because they're different industries and different skill sets that we learn and heuristics.
That's a great question, Christopher. And also, I love sort of like I'd love to hear you more about sort of like your strategy and the NASA and NSF grants that you put in the chat. There's, I think sort of like playful storytelling in games are different. You could probably in the game design, people are probably more attached to sort of like ludology and sort of like the mechanics of play than sort of interactive storytellers. But you know, when you start thinking strictly about games, you're introducing elements like win-lose conditions, your tactics that lead to evolving strategies that can be deployed in creative ways, spirits of competition and stuff like that. And those are sort of like the heart, I think, of game design. But interactive storytelling, there's all kinds of cool interactive storytelling, from Sleep No More to just choose your own adventures, to kind of give people sort of a sandbox to explore the stories they want to tell. And that said, I have a friend, a former colleague of mine, who would play games like Fallout, and he would try to complete games with no violence. Like, that was his provocation. He would be like, "Ooh, I'm going to complete this game that's designed around like gamified violence, but I want to see if I can actually create the counter narrative." In a way, I think he's kind of creating a playful story space by working almost against the design of the thing itself.
Well, we did some pop-ups experiments from the user, and when we told them the user was a detective, they were more critical thinking. When they were a reporter working with a story, they did more interpretive thinking. Or if they were different roles, so each role had provoked a different type of thinking. So the design of the role applied to what we were doing a pop-up with, a digital interspace. And when you bring it into a different context, we start playing. Well, game mechanics tend to play the player versus them playing the game.
Yeah, I love that idea. I'm working on a project now where we're starting to think about roles and whether roles are going to help the visitor or whether roles will kind of get in the way of them just being themselves. But we're starting to kind of do some early stage planning to user tasks, sort of like, how do you frame the narrative such that does it need the role play or not? I think in many instances, like, the role play is helpful. If any of you if you've ever played the game Fiasco, it's a small rule book where a bunch of people LARP, they live action role play, and invent a Coen Brothers film.
I love it.
And they all have a role. They have an inciting object, which is usually something like a briefcase full of money. And one of the things that I love about this, it's a gamified learning experience, is almost everyone will die. And the only way to really fail is to die in an unmemorable way. So when you see your character on the death arc, you just like turn up the volume on it. And it's almost like, okay, I need to die. It's inevitable. I'm going to die as a character in this game. But what I want to do is die with impact such that it influences everyone else's arc. And it's a really cool way to kind of invert and play with this trope.
I love it. I love it. I'm going to jump down a little bit. Dina, did you want to ask your question?
Sure, yeah. I was wondering if you had shortcuts to get people to loosen up into a space or into the vision or into the conversation, because I feel like giving permission is super important, and people are resistant to play and are resistant to like really get into it. And you spoke to like it taking an hour for people to be okay to play with the music experience you had mentioned.
Yeah, I think that's probably, of the stuff I talked about, I think that's maybe the hardest to actually like put to work. And there's lots of ways to onboard people. It's like if you're making a casual game, you've got a minute. Mobile game, you basically got a minute to onboard somebody to having a positive experience, and within that minute, they will decide whether to continue playing in that game. So you don't have an hour. You've got roughly 15 to 20 seconds to give them a positive, action-oriented, emotional experience. Basically a win. And so I think a lot of times it's sort of durational, like how much time do you have with somebody? Do you need to take them on that whole journey of like creating this pocket of safety, or do you just need to give them a win? But kind of how do you manufacture that? Yeah, that kind of pocket is tough, and I think it depends a lot on the duration of the experience, who your audience is. Adults are super fearful with interactive experiences and hyper tentative, whereas if you're designing for children, they will gleefully break that shit, and they will have the best time doing it. Like, they'll have a positive experience. Like, you don't need to necessarily prime kids a lot as much as you do with adults. So I think audience, duration are two key factors, and I would say content risk. Like, what's at stake? Like, if somebody feels they are going to be judged because they did something wrong, that's high stakes for an adult. If it feels like they can take a big decision, they can take a risk with very low consequence, maybe you need less priming, or you just need to give them that win early on. Let them do that big manufactured thing and celebrate a failure. So I think the strategies kind of shift depending on sort of like who they are, what they're doing, and how long the experience might last.
All right.
Thank you.
RJ, do you want to ask your question, or is that Re? I'm sorry.
Hi, I'm in a Starbucks, so sorry for the
sure.
background noise. Well, I was really curious about also this onboarding process. And I really liked your scale of talking about how onboarding could be, or like in designing the process, you're thinking about disengagement and engagement, like engagement in the middle and two different sides, and you have the like thinking, learning process and the emotional feeling process. And then I was curious, like, have you found anything that's like a happy balance to bring the audience, I guess, into the onboarding process? I'm also curious about that. But then through the process, like, how do you know you found the happy balance? And like, what is that like to design that? Like, how do you know when you found it? Are there any other things that you found? I really also appreciated when you were saying it depends on the duration, it depends on all these other factors, like what you're making, how you're designing it. But I'm super curious, like, how you find these percentages, and then like how you figure out like when you found it.
Yeah. I'm gonna have a totally unsatisfying answer for you. User testing, prototyping and user testing very often. Being deliberate about that, I think. Like when I try and do a lot of user testing, I'm a big fan of the A/B test, where I'll try and do something that is maybe a little bit more gradual ramp up, and then I'll try and create a thing that just throws somebody into the, like, where narrative design is called, like being in media res. Like you start in the middle of the action. And there's plenty of really good experiences like that. There's Uncharted is a great game series. Sorry, a bunch of video game references because I like, that's the industry I came from, but it's the industry I most often reference in the design of experiences for other industries, because video game designers are just so smart about how they onboard people, particularly to an experience. But in Uncharted, you're usually, every game, it's a whole series, starts off, you as the main character, Nathan Drake, are just thrown smack in the middle of a chaotic situation. But the variables within that system are really limited, the choices you can take, and don't have a lot of consequence. Like you could just kind of like madly click around and find success. And so they really kind of help you, shepherd you through the experience. Whereas a game like, and so by the time you're actually like, you get out of that situation, that Indiana Jones style situation where everything is going wrong, but yet you emerge unscathed, you're like, what did I just do? Because they're not really, they don't really care about you deploying any strategy at that point. The game developers know you're gonna win that situation. They've ensured it. So by the time you've been onboarded within that first minute, you've gone through this wild emotional chaotic roller coaster, emerged unscathed, and emerged feeling successful, like, knowing nothing, I still kicked ass. But they've created the variable such that everybody who experiences that is going to kick ass, which is really powerful.
Hey, Brad, yeah, I kind of want to rip on it for a little bit too, which is that, like, you know, it's interesting because like I sometimes find like when we think about like designing experiences, like, or even like designing museums, like we're always like looking for like the answer. It's like, you know, like how do you design a museum? You know, how do you do like what's the trick? And it's like, but like this is like an art form, right? Yeah. And it's like how do you, and it's like even, and like within any art form, if you like look at like books, you know, like you know, you can read like a George R. Martin book. You can read Babysitter's Club graphic novels. Like there's just like so many permutations and like so many ways you can like mash up and bring things together. And I feel like, you know, like I think part of what I really like about being in the museum space is that like it's been something that's been very sort of like, there's been a script of how to do it for a long time. And I think now we're seeing like, there's a lot of different ways to do it, and there's a lot of opportunity to like challenge, and play and do a lot of random crap with this medium.
Can I just add, sorry, really quickly? I'm most curious. I'm also a dancer, and I like thinking about designing installations and experiences to put people into their bodies.
Yeah.
And I'm super curious about, because I feel like video games are easier, right? We can easily disconnect from our body and go straight into our thinking brain, and we don't have to connect to our emotions or connect to our bodies. But when you design an experience that's asking people to connect to their bodies, you're already putting them in a really vulnerable position, especially if it's social. And I'm really curious, like, if you found anything, I don't know, like what other experiences are out there that have worked well, that aren't just like a museum space or aren't just like a video game space, both of which I really enjoy, but I'm most curious about the like lived experience part of building the
Yeah.
experience.
Yeah, that's great. There's Punch Drunk, like Sleep No More. There's immersive experiences where you're passive and yet with agency within the space. You're sharing space with performers who are these incredible dancers and actors. But because you're right next to them, there's no proscenium, there's no distance between you and the performer. Like you are proximal to them. It kind of like creates the sense that you're like embodied within the experience, even though you're just walking around. The show that I produced, the Shuffle Challenge, in the third act, we would invert it and then start inviting the audience members up. And what we would do in that experience is for the first two acts, we would just model big and small interactions that were rewarded to the audience. So the dancers would take they would like model, like just, I'll do a small thing, boop, like just a tiny little interaction and celebrate the heck out of that moment. And so people started to see like, oh, you don't need to be grand. You don't need to be trained. You don't need to be like this other person to be celebrated and to have power in that situation. My wife produces this show called Nature Stories, in which she works with researchers and scientists and musicians and dancers to create this co-created dialogue about scientific phenomena told through art and dance. And it's really interesting because to see these scientists who, for the most part, are not like embodied learners. They spent their life getting a PhD, like doing their research, to think about the expression of like what these ideas mean when it comes through the body, and just developing that kind of the vocabulary for it.
Yeah. I'll say one, like we can totally do a future spaces on this because I think it's super interesting. Just from my own perspective, I would go and like almost do an exercise, like look at all the places that people like dance, concerts, weddings, like where are the places where they would like normally dance, and like also look at the audience and see like what would keep them from dancing, and then play with the conditions. And as Brad said, just prototype, like try. Anyway, though, guys, this went really quickly, and we're kind of at time. Brad, thanks so much again for doing this. We got it recorded. We're gonna put it up there. We're gonna share it widely. If you guys didn't, there were so many questions that we didn't get to. So if I'll try to like maybe find a time to talk with Brad, and we can figure out a way to answer those. And then if you guys have other questions, just email me or Brad. I'm sure we're both open to like making sure that we respond accordingly. For y'all Americans, happy 4th of July, happy Canada Day. Brad, any parting words?
I just wanted to I'm going to just express gratitude. Thank you for choosing to spend an hour with us today. This was fantastic. And like Josh is saying, like maybe we can find a formal way to follow up. If you want to just reach out to me individually and have a conversation, I'm always game for that.
All right, awesome. Well, happy 4th, everyone. Everyone have a great weekend. We will cycle back soon. Thanks so much for being here. We'll talk soon. See y'all. Bye. Thanks, Brad.